how the IMF and the West debt-trapped Egypt. So it's a long list of people that the IMF and the World Bank and several other Western institutions like J.P. Morgan Chase or Merrill Lynch or you name it, like Blackstone, BlackRock. These kind of people, they go out and that's their job, is to debt trap people, to debt trap companies, to debt trap governments. Whoever they can loan money to at a predatory rate, that's who they're going to go after. So this was particularly interesting because, of course, President Sisi, pictured there, is an authoritarian dictator, okay? But he's extremely warm and welcoming with the U.S., and the U.S. and him have a very cozy relationship. And we're going to find out why, I think, in this piece. So stick around. You ever been to Egypt, Mike?
No.
Me neither. But if you're Egyptian, please come on the show. I'd love to ask you questions about the politics in Egypt, but if you're allowed. The IMF, Western financial institutions, played a significant role in Egypt's ongoing economic crisis, contributing to a cycle of debt that has caused severe problems for the country. Now, repeated loan cycles and mounting debt. Let's talk about that. Egypt has received multiple IMF loans in recent years, including $3 billion package in 2022, okay, and an expanded $8 billion deal in 2024. These recurring loans indicate ongoing economic difficulties rather than sustainable solutions. The country's foreign debt has surged to over $165 billion as of March 2023, more than tripling since 2013. Okay, this massive debt burden poses a significant threat to Egypt's economy and stability and sovereignty. And these countries will do this. They will borrow loans at a low interest rate, and then to pay them back, they'll get one at a high interest rate and pay off the low interest. They'll do, robbing Peter to pay Paul kind of thing, and not getting anywhere and staying in a cycle of perpetual debt. According to the Central Bank of Egypt, the $52 billion of the country owes to multilateral institutions, including 44% is owed to the IMF, which means Egypt owes about $23 billion to the IMF, which that's almost half of their debt is to the IMF. Egypt's total external debt has grown so substantially in years. As of March 2023, it's at $165 billion total. The IMF has recently agreed to increase Egypt's bailout loan from $3 billion to $8 billion. This new agreement is going to further increase Egypt's debt to the IMF. So continuing to borrow money. Hey, when you owe money to the mafia, go back to the mafia, get some more money so that you can pay back the mafia. This makes no sense, okay? And yet this is the way global finance is happening, especially when it comes to international development. We're doing this under the guise of helping these people. We're going to help them. We're going to build a bridge, build a dam, help the kids, save the whales, save the snails. This is not the real story. The real story is the politicians are going to pocket it, squander it, lose it, abscond with it, and the people are going to be left to foot the bill in the form of austerity measures, privatization, the whole 9 yards, deregulation. So the IMF loans come out with conditions for economic reforms, including adopting a flexible exchange rate and decreasing public spending and encouraging growth in the private sector. So that's exactly what I said. And this was a more fancy way to say deregulation, privatization, when they start taxing people and they start decreasing money for education and they start increasing the amount of corporations that are allowed to control things like the water or the electricity and start overcharging and, absconding with the resources of the country and the labor of the people. Typical stuff. IMF loans often come with strict conditions that require governments to enact unpopular reforms or limit public spending. In Egypt's case, these have included mandates to adopt neoliberal policies such as privatization, cutting social services, and trade liberalization, which is just funny talk for They want you to sell their potatoes. You're going to sell me your potatoes and you're going to do it at a good price. And I'm going to tell you what price you're going to sell me the potatoes at because you owe me money. I'll just beat you up and take the potatoes if you don't like it. That's generally the foreign policy strategy there. So these, the currency and devaluation and inflation, okay? So as part of IMF mandated reforms, Egypt has been pushed to adopt a more flexible exchange rate system. This has led to a sharp decline in the value of the Egyptian pound, including a 14.5% drop in the against the US dollar in October 2022. Now this results in the currency instability and will continue to contribute to soaring inflation rates, reaching a 5-year peak and making basic goods unaffordable for a large portion of the population. So right there, isn't that interesting that they can force you to control the value of your currency? If you don't pay your debts, the IMF will come in and tell you to devalue your currency, to weaken your own government, to weaken your people, to drive people into poverty so that you can meet your debts. They don't talk about restructuring. They don't talk about, we'll work with you days, nights, weekends, whatever it takes. No. They're gonna drape you over a chair and they're gonna pound your bottom. Yeah.
It's funny because that's like literally the kind of conniving conspiracy level stuff that the right wingers attribute to people like George Soros, because they always attribute, like, there was a reference that one time that he made some kind of crazy currency move where he made billions of dollars and then impoverished the entire country because he like bet a certain way on a currency, but then also controlled the market enough that he was able to influence that same bet. I don't know the particulars. I just know that right wingers have constantly thrown that in my face.
It was the pound. It was the pound. He bet against the pound and he won big. Yeah.
Yeah. But then they ignore issues like this where it's obviously neocolonialism. It's in the West's favor. It's against brown people. So they either ignore that, or if you talk to a right winger, they turn into von Mises all of a sudden. They turn into Rothbard himself. They turn into the most libertarian of libertarians and say, well, we just need to abolish all governments because states are clearly the problem. It's like, okay, but one is more predatory than the other here. Like, there's clearly a bad actor here that's impoverishing millions of people, and it also happens to be working in your favor. So it's weird that you suggest a totally unrealistic solution like abolishing all states when we're talking about something very concrete in practice here, when you have other policy solutions that are very temporary and reformist when it comes to other issues like trans rights or something. You have like ideas about how to actually outlaw something in the meantime that doesn't really upend the entire system. You're not talking about abolishing all governments then. It's weird how the libertarians work in that way, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. What was it that the this is no bullshit that Javier Milei, the libertarian president of Argentina, said that he's gonna, as a libertarian, ban abortions. Now, right there, he's using the government to get what he wants, to hinder the personal freedoms of other people. That's not libertarian at all. That's using the government to your advantage to get what you want and oppress people that you want to oppress. That's authoritarianism. That's a form of fascism. Make people bend to your value system. And on top of that, he also believes you can sell your baby on the open market.
Of course.
Great. Just great dichotomy there. Prioritizing debt repayment over social needs. Now, in Egypt, the IMF's policies prioritize debt repayment over the immediate needs of the populations that's in crisis. So this approach has exacerbated poverty and economic stability in Egypt. High inflation rates have made essential goods like vegetables, dairy products, and bread increasingly expensive, forcing a lot of families to constrain their diets. There's also the misallocation of resources. Critics argue that Egypt's focus on luxury mega projects, while neglecting essential sectors like education, healthcare, also contributed to economic instability. And there is a lot of that in these countries where they'll have a big, it's a personal project from some wanker of a politician who wants to show an edifice, to show his, we're going to build a giant casino or a giant museum or a giant opera house or a football stadium for the World Cup in order to, whatever. it's mostly a legacy project for rich people, and it does nothing for the common good. This happens all the time. Tajikistan, or maybe I forget one of the stands. Turkmenistan, I think. It's amazing. Everything is like that. Everything's a giant statue for a rich person. Everything's designed from the ground up for the wealthy. Big, useless kind of architecture. Interesting. Perpetuating military dominance, the IMF's approach has failed to address the Egyptian military's outsized role in the economy, which hinders the private sector competition and deters investment. This has also perpetuated a system that benefits elite while failing to create broad-based economic growth. The repeated need for IMF loans and financial aid from the Gulf countries has created just this horrible cycle of dependency for Egypt. These short-term solutions don't actually address the root causes of instability, and leave the country vulnerable to external economic shocks, price changes, stuff like that. And the fact that there's a lack of accountability, where the IMF has been criticized for weak accountability standards and focusing on making new loans rather than ensuring development targets are met. So they don't really care if the targets are met. They just want to make sure that they keep writing down in their little books that they lent money to somebody. That when you write debt down in your book as like a potential win later, the value of your company gets up. You can take out more things on collateral. You can, it's a way to boost your value, right? It's by writing down someone else's debt. Well, he owes me $1,500, so I'll write it down in the book, and then that'll make me look good. When they have earnings calls for stocks and stuff, this is good enough for a lot of these companies. Like Bank of America is publicly traded. If you were to ask them at their earnings call, how are they doing? They say, we're doing great. We have an amazing amount of debt out there right now. We've lent out a bunch of money and we're expecting it to be paid back in 10 years' time. There's no guarantee if those loans weren't double checked that you're not going to go under, right? Or that debt is not actually the money that you think it is. When people default, the entire economy goes under. That's what we saw in 2008. So I just wanted to also talk about who owns the debt in Egypt. 44% is to the IMF, like we said, and a bunch of other institutions own the remaining 55. So, and a lot of them are Gulf countries. You have UAE, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, they own some. Other major creditors are Japan, Germany, France, United Kingdom, United States, and China. So crazy. And so I don't know would you know anything about the history of Egypt and this guy who just came in? Because I just learned today. It was quite interesting.
Now, didn't they I don't actually know, but didn't they I could totally be wrong about this. I'm going to show my ass if I am, but didn't the US or the West somehow have a hand in overthrowing the previous guy? And wasn't it Mubarak?
I think it was. I think it was the Arab Spring, and they with the help of the West, they overthrew the guy. And then they put in another guy who might have been Mubarak, but he was definitely Muslim Brotherhood. And he was democratically elected, as far as I understand. And then we didn't like that either, so we overthrew that guy. I was going to say,
was that democratically elected the way that, like, Yanukovych or Yats or something? Like, is this another Yats is our guy situation is what I'm getting at?
Well, how good is democracy these days anyway?
Yeah.
Right? So the United States continued its support for Egyptian's authoritarian government led by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. It's sort of raised eyebrows among human rights advocates and democracy proponents worldwide because the support, which persists despite Egypt's well-documented human rights abuses and suppression of political dissent, is partly rooted in Egypt's strategic role in containing anti-Zionist sentiment among its population. So you won't believe this. The main reason why we have such a strong relationship to Egypt right now is really highly predicated on whether or not the current administration in Egypt is pro-Zionist. And any kind of anti-Zionist messages that start popping up in Egypt, Egypt's responsibility is to crack down on them. America says, hey, you cannot have these protests going on about Israel in your country. Stop it right away. And because this guy is an authoritarian with ties to the United States, President Sisi, he does it. He doesn't ask a question. America says jump, he says how high. Egypt, with its population of 100 million, long been a key player in the Middle East geopolitical landscape. It has a peace treaty with Israel, signed in 1979. This was a significant shift in the regional dynamics and has been pretty much a cornerstone of the U.S. policy in the area ever since. So the United States is really leaning on Egypt to keep their word to the peace plan that they've had in place since 79. The United States views Egypt as a crucial ally in maintaining stability in the region, particularly in relation to Israel's security. Interesting. One primary reason for the U.S. support of Egypt's current regime is perceived effectiveness of suppressing the anti-Zionist sentiments. The Egyptian government has consistently worked to contain and control public expressions of anti-Israel sentiment, which are widespread among the Egyptian population. And this control extends to media censorship, restrictions on public gatherings, and the suppression of political opposition that might champion more hostile policies towards Israel. So, actively trying to do the bidding of the U.S. So if you want to know if President Sisi is a puppet of the U.S., it appears so. It appears so. The current administration in Egypt is nothing more than a puppet of the West. And I'm sure he lives in opulence, pockets IMF money, and lets everybody live in an authoritarian shithole.
Not surprised.
Surprise, surprise. The Al-Sisi government's approach aligns with U.S. interests for several reasons, okay? It maintains the Israel peace treaty. They have intelligence cooperation. The Suez Canal access, which is a huge part of the story that I cannot stress enough, that the Suez Canal was once owned by foreign people and it was nationalized sometime in the 20th century. In the 50s, I believe, 59, they had the Suez crisis. And then since then, it has been Egyptian with access going to other people, as far as I know. But the Suez Canal is a strategic point. It allows goods and stuff to go in and out of the region into probably goes from the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean, and allows ships to go through. A lot like the Panama Canal. Huge, important place to have access to. And the last thing is also counterterrorism stuff. So anytime that the U.S. is asking for counterterrorism help, Egypt is pretty much obligated to help. But it caught the support that Egypt gives the U.S. is a significant cost to the democratic values and human rights, as Sisi's regime has been accused of widespread human rights abuses, including arbitrary detentions, torture, suppression of free speech, and political opposition. And of course, the international human rights organizations are saying this is a blatant hypocrisy. The U.S. buddying up with authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia, but then waggling our finger at a place like Libya for their perceived human rights violation, which the evidence is slim on that.
It's the old meme. It's the guy from Breaking Bad, Bryan Cranston, and he's like saying to some other characters, like, why did you invade Libya? Or why did you invade other places? It's like, because they have nuclear. It's like, well, why don't you invade Russia or DPRK? It's like, are you crazy? They have nuclear. And it's like such a caveman style meme. It's like barely broken English, but it gets the point effectively across. It's like the U.S. has invaded so many countries for proposed or supposed violations of human rights or weapons of mass destruction or whatever, and then totally leaves countries that have more power, more ability to defend themselves, more, what do you call it, like built up and enforceable nation states. I don't want to say that like other countries are like tribes of warlords like our friend did, but like there are countries that have bigger infrastructure, that have more formidable militaries, and the U.S. for some reason doesn't see fit to invade those countries. And I can't imagine why that is. Do they not have the moral authority there, or they just not have the ability?
Yeah, really. I mean, this is a great question. I mean, shit. It's it's insane that we've gone this long without knowing any of this stuff or just brushing it under the rug. Well, since 1978, the U.S. has provided Egypt with approximately $1.3 billion in military aid. So they're giving them money. That's part of the deal. Part of the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, aiming to promote regional stability and secure Egypt as a strategic ally in the Middle East, is also one of the things that keeps them shackled to the U.S. because if they break that agreement, they will be considered a hostile entity and be, subjugated just like most of the other countries who have gone against the West. In 2022, the U.S. approved significant arms sales to Egypt, including 12 Super Hercules C-130 transport aircraft worth $2.2 billion and air defense radar systems valued at about $355 million. These sales underscore the ongoing military cooperation. However, the Biden administration faced pressure to address the human rights concerns in Egypt, but of course, he usually just pays lip service to these kind of things. But the administration did decide to withhold $85 million of annual military aid due to these issues. So I think that that's a show. They pretend like they care so much about the human rights violations in that part of the world, but it is integral that we have somebody in the driver's seat in Egypt that's going to do what we want him to do. Wants to drive where we tell him to drive. So, well, tell me what you really think. Well, a historical context should add another layer onto this because during the Arab Spring in 2011, the U.S. supplied ammunition being used against protesters. So it was our bullets that were shooting the protesters. That's undeniable link to where if you looked on the stamp of the gun on most atrocities in the world, you probably find the Made in the USA sticker on it. But Mike, I think I'll tell you what I really think, because the IMF, the paragon of neoliberal orthodoxy, has become Egypt's most ardent creditor, doling out billions of loans with the regularity of a metronome. Egypt's economic stability remains frustratingly out of reach. The country's foreign debt has swollen to incredible proportions, tripling since 2013 to a staggering $165 billion. A veritable United Nations of creditors has lined up to stake their claim on Egypt's future, from the oil-rich Gulf states to the industrial powerhouses of Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, the United States plays the role of the conflicted benefactor, caught between its professed values of human rights and its strategic interests of resources and delicious oil. Egypt teeters on the precipice of economic calamity, propped up by a precarious scaffolding of loans, aid, and geopolitical expediency. It's a situation that would make Kafka nod in a grim recognition, a bureaucratic nightmare of global proportions, where the solution to debt is more debt, and the price of stability is actually, your freedom.